She characterized him as an imminent peril to the very foundations of democratic governance. In response, he merely offered the subtle, knowing expression of a veteran attorney who had devoted 7 arduous years to defending individuals accused of lethal violence before pivoting to lead federal prosecutions against international extremists. Subsequently, he unlatched his meticulously crafted leather attaché case. Contained within its compartments were the compiled echoes of 60 exhaustive jury trials, extensive documentation detailing a billion-dollar financial deception, and the tangled, convoluted histories of 3 inexplicable marriages that defied simple comprehension. Chamber 2154 within the Rayburn House office building was never architecturally conceived with personal comfort in mind. Rather, its very essence was engineered to facilitate intense adversarial encounters. The committee's dais sits elevated, taking the form of a sweeping, curved bench constructed from imposing dark wood, strategically positioning the members of the legislative body to physically and symbolically look down upon the witness table situated below. The architectural layout was profoundly intentional, communicating a silent but undeniable message. The committee stood in a position of supreme authority, while the summoned individual remained firmly obligated to provide answers and accountability. On this particular morning in late January, the legislative chamber was packed to a capacity it had not witnessed in a considerable number of years. The public gallery, comprising 300 seats, arranged in ascending rows directly behind the primary witness table, contained a diverse cross-section of the American populace that would have been virtually unimaginable to prior generations of political observers. Occupying the left flank of the seating area were numerous families residing in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood of Minneapolis, widely recognized as the most substantial Somali-American enclave within the borders of the United States. A significant proportion of the women in attendance wore traditional hijabs, while many of the men donned kufi caps, all sitting impeccably upright, bearing the dignified, quiet tension of citizens who profoundly understood that the proceedings unfolding in this room would inexorably shape the broader national perception of their community. Conversely, the right flank of the gallery hosted an entirely different demographic, consisting primarily of transparency advocates, financial auditors, and a select handful of concerned parents who had undertaken the long journey from Minnesota to the nation's capital. These individuals had been motivated to attend after discovering, through investigative journalism reports and unsealed judicial documents, that substantial federal subsidies expressly allocated for the nutritional sustenance of vulnerable children had allegedly been diverted to finance the acquisition of lucrative lakefront real estate, opulent luxury vehicles, and premium-class international travel accommodations to the Maldives. Situated precisely between these two distinct factions, occupying the neutral territory of the Central Isle, were members of the credentialed press corps. Their professional equipment, including high-resolution cameras secured on sturdy tripods, boom microphones extending outward on articulated arms, and the persistent, glowing crimson recording indicators of C-SPAN broadcasting equipment, monitored the room like small, infinitely patient sentinels. The anticipated witness made his entrance at precisely 9:15, arriving several minutes ahead of the scheduled commencement. Kash Patel, globally recognized simply as Kash, navigated his way into the expansive room with the exact same deliberate, unbothered demeanor he had utilized when entering countless legal courtrooms over the preceding 2 decades. He arrived entirely unaccompanied, carrying only a single leather briefcase, and wearing a tailored suit that projected professional competence without demanding unnecessary attention. There was no trailing entourage of aides, no deputy director strategically flanking his right shoulder, and absolutely no public relations personnel hurriedly whispering last-minute strategic talking points into his ear. He appeared simply as a solitary man, armed with a leather folio, mirroring the identical approach he had taken when striding into the judicial halls of Miami-Dade County, Florida, as a 26-year-old public defender, representing marginalized individuals whom the prosecutorial state sought to incarcerate for the remainder of their natural lives. At his current age of 45, he held the esteemed position of Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, serving as the 9th individual to officially hold that title, and notably, the very first leader of South Asian heritage to ascend to the role. His dark hair was maintained in a disciplined, close-cropped style. His jawline was immaculately clean-shaven, and his brown eyes possessed a dual nature, appearing genuinely warm during casual, informal discourse, yet transitioning into something considerably more piercing and calculating under the harsh fluorescent illumination of high-stakes investigative arenas like the one he currently occupied. As the preliminary questioning was about to commence, he carefully positioned his briefcase upon the wooden witness table. He methodically poured himself a glass of filtered water, took his designated seat, and purposefully rested his hands entirely flat upon the tabletop. This specific physical posture was a deeply ingrained habit retained from his early days as a public defender, an era during which he had intimately learned that seated juries inherently trust individuals who keep their hands fully visible, while instinctively harboring suspicion toward those who attempt to conceal them beneath the desk. The elected members of the Oversight Committee gradually filtered into the grand room, with the Republican representatives arriving first, closely followed by their Democratic counterparts. Eventually, the committee chairman made his entrance. He was a seasoned Republican representative, hailing from Kentucky, an official who had meticulously constructed his lengthy political career upon the foundation of rigorously investigating the financial irregularities of public figures, and who approached his current mandate with the relentless, focused enthusiasm of a tracking hound that has finally isolated a vital scent. Seated to his immediate left was the committee's vice chair, a Democratic representative from Maryland, who was currently organizing her briefing materials with the highly studied, artificial neutrality of an experienced politician who had already deduced that the forthcoming morning session would likely prove deeply uncomfortable for her political faction. The final committee member to assume her elevated position was Representative Ilhan Omar. She chose to enter through a discreet side passage explicitly reserved for seated committee members, utilizing a minor but distinct privilege of institutional authority that physically deposited her much closer to the elevated dais and distinctly further away from the general public seating area, almost as if the very architecture of the building sought to place a barrier between her and the constituents she was elected to serve. She was dressed in a deeply hued purple hijab, paired with a structured, dark-toned blazer. Her physical carriage projected profound confidence, exhibiting the unmistakable stride of a resilient woman who had successfully navigated the harrowing realities of a Kenyan refugee settlement, triumphed in highly contested elections to enter the United States Congress as the first Somali-American representative in the institution's history, been prominently featured on the globally recognized cover of Time magazine, faced severe condemnation from factions within her own political party, endured removal from the prestigious Foreign Affairs Committee, navigated exhaustive inquiries by the House Ethics Office, and yet remarkably emerged from every successive political crisis with her legislative seat fully intact and her public voice entirely undiminished. Upon taking her assigned position upon the curved wooden bench, she directed a brief, highly evaluative glance toward Patel. It was the precise, calculating look of a seasoned political operator actively assessing whether the individual seated across the divide represented an insurmountable obstacle or a potential strategic opportunity. Patel calmly met her gaze, his facial expression remaining perfectly static, while his hands continued to rest firmly and visibly upon the tabletop. The presiding chairman officially brought the administrative hearing to order with a strike of the gavel. He announced that the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform was resuming its comprehensive investigation into the alleged fraudulent misallocation and systemic misuse of federal grant funding within the state of Minnesota. He formally introduced the witness as the Honorable Kash Patel, the current director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, expressing the committee's gratitude for his voluntary appearance. Following these procedural formalities, the chair officially yielded the floor, recognizing Representative Omar to initiate the first designated round of formal questioning. Omar leaned forward, positioning herself closer to her desktop microphone. When she finally vocalized her thoughts, her speech carried the distinct, penetrating clarity characteristic of an individual who had dedicated her entire adult life to ensuring her perspectives were recognized initially within marginalized refugee communities, subsequently on the floor of the Minnesota State Legislature, and ultimately within the hallowed halls of the United States Congress. She addressed Director Patel directly, asserting that a significant multitude of community members residing within her congressional district harbored profound concerns that the ongoing federal investigation was heavily influenced by partisan political motivations. She elaborated that her constituents feared the probe disproportionately targeted the Somali American demographic in a calculated effort to advance the prevailing administration's broader political agenda. Before allowing the proceedings to advance any further, she challenged the director to explicitly commit to the Oversight Committee that the Bureau under his command would execute this highly sensitive investigation with absolute fairness, entirely devoid of inherent bias, and strictly without the implementation of the racially focused profiling tactics that her represented communities so deeply feared. This opening maneuver was undeniably strategic and robust. It immediately established the specific narrative framework she desired, prioritizing the concept of social fairness over the mechanics of financial fraud, and emphasizing demographic identity over documented evidentiary records. Her statement implicitly signaled that the foundational nature of the inquiry was inherently connected to racial dynamics, suggesting that any individual expressing support for the probe was potentially complicit in institutional prejudice. Patel responded by taking a slow, deliberate sip from his water glass. He gently returned the glass to the table. When he eventually spoke, the cadence of his voice was distinctly measured. However, it was not the cautious, calculated measurement typically employed by a defensive politician carefully navigating potential rhetorical pitfalls. Rather, it was the highly disciplined measurement of an experienced trial attorney who had long ago internalized the psychological reality that the most devastatingly effective statements are inevitably the most concise. Addressing the Congresswoman, he recounted the origins of his professional journey, noting that he had commenced his legal career serving as a public defender within the demanding jurisdiction of Miami-Dade County, Florida. He detailed how he had dedicated 7 full years to advocating on behalf of marginalized individuals whom the broader judicial system was seemingly eager to discard, including those accused of homicide, individuals involved in illicit narcotics distribution, and impoverished citizens who entirely lacked the financial resources to secure private legal counsel and were consequently assigned representation by the courts. He emphasized that his fundamental role had been to fiercely protect their constitutional liberties, driven by the core belief that within the American judicial framework, even those accused of the most egregious societal transgressions are inherently entitled to a vigorous and competent defense. He allowed a momentary pause to settle over the room, utilizing the precise, rhythmic timing of a seasoned litigator, permitting a crucial premise to fully absorb into the audience's consciousness before delivering the subsequent logical progression. He then articulated that consequently, when he provided an assurance that the current investigation would be conducted with absolute fairness. He possessed an intimate and profound understanding of what that specific concept truly entailed. Having personally lived and experienced the reality of the judicial system from the opposing side of the courtroom aisle, he initiated another brief pause, slightly shorter in duration than the previous one, before firmly adding the caveat that the concept of fairness simultaneously dictates that absolutely no individual is permitted to exist above the supreme authority of the law, expressly including elected members of the United States Congress. The atmosphere within the expansive chamber underwent a subtle but palpable shift. It was not a visually obvious transformation. No attendees visibly shifted in their chairs, no audible gasps echoed through the gallery, and no murmurs of dissent rippled through the audience. Yet, the ambient tension in the air fundamentally altered, mirroring the atmospheric changes that precede a severe meteorological event. When the barometric pressure suddenly drops, the surrounding wildlife falls eerily silent, and every individual accustomed to enduring turbulent weather instinctively recognizes that a storm is rapidly approaching. A fraction of an inch of tension appeared around Omar's eyes. It was the minuscule but telling physical reaction that differentiates an elected official who maintains absolute narrative control from one who has abruptly recognized that the opposing participant flatly refuses to adhere to the conversational script she had meticulously prepared for him. Nevertheless, Omar recovered her composure with remarkable swiftness. Regardless of any other assessments of her character, she was fundamentally a survivor, and individuals who have successfully navigated existential threats rarely permit themselves to lose their poise over a singular, rhetorical exchange. Her personal history included surviving the devastation of a violent civil conflict, enduring the harsh deprivations of a refugee encampment, successfully navigating a persistently hostile domestic political landscape, and weathering the sustained, highly publicized criticisms of a sitting head of state who had previously suggested on national television that she should return to her nation of origin. Consequently, a bureaucratic witness possessing a sharp rhetorical edge was highly unlikely to visibly unnerve her. She readjusted her posture, leaning back toward the microphone to press her inquiry. She implored Director Patel to permit her to ask him a highly direct question, noting for the official record that the overwhelming majority of the individuals facing federal indictment within the complex Feeding Our Future financial inquiry were, in fact, members of the Somali American community. She further highlighted that the chief executive of the nation had previously utilized highly derogatory language, specifically quoting the term garbage when referring to certain immigrant populations, while concurrently suggesting that these groups provided no meaningful societal contributions. Given this highly charged political context, she demanded to know whether he genuinely believed that his agency's investigation was being executed without the insidious influence of inherent racial bias. This line of questioning constituted a highly sophisticated rhetorical trap. If the director offered a simple affirmative response, she was perfectly positioned to publicly accuse him of willfully ignoring the systemic realities of racial profiling. Conversely, if he provided a negative response, she would immediately weaponize his own admission against the broader administration. Regardless of which standard answer he selected, the resulting media headlines would inevitably focus on issues of racial animus rather than the underlying allegations of systemic financial fraud. Patel, however, explicitly declined to walk through either of the conversational doors she had presented. Instead, he systematically constructed an entirely different pathway. Addressing the representative, he calmly revealed that he was the direct descendant of Indian immigrants who had formerly resided in Uganda. He elaborated that his father, Pramod Patel, had been born in the East African nation to a family possessing Gujarati heritage. He systematically recounted the historical events of 1972, noting that the authoritarian dictator Idi Amin had abruptly issued an executive decree, mandating the immediate and total expulsion of all individuals of Asian descent residing within the Ugandan borders. They were granted a mere 90 days to comply. During that chaotic period, he explained, his father's family was systematically stripped of their entire livelihood, losing their familial residence, their established commercial enterprises, and their deeply rooted community connections. He emphasized with quiet intensity that this traumatic expulsion was executed exclusively due to the racial characteristics of their skin. He permitted the historical weight of this statement to permeate the quiet room. Continuing his narrative, he detailed how his family subsequently arrived on American shores, possessing absolutely nothing of material value. They were forced to meticulously reconstruct their existence from absolute zero within the suburban landscape of Long Island, New York. Through sheer determination, his father eventually secured a position as a financial officer, while his mother dedicated herself to raising their children. He noted that his parents had collectively provided him with every conceivable opportunity that the American societal structure offered, including access to higher education, fundamental personal liberties, and the remarkable trajectory that allowed him to evolve from a local public defender to a federal prosecutor specializing in counterterrorism, and ultimately to his current prestigious role, commanding the nation's premier law enforcement agency. Throughout this recitation, the volume of his voice never artificially elevated, nor did its tone become noticeably abrasive. He simply continued to speak with the unwavering steadiness characteristic of an individual presenting verifiable, historical facts that strictly required no emotional embellishment. He firmly requested that the Congresswoman refrain from attempting to lecture him regarding the profound complexities and inherent pains associated with the immigrant experience. He asserted unequivocally that he had personally lived through those exact dynamics, as had his entire extended family, emphasizing that they had navigated the complex legal immigration frameworks, constructed their new lives with absolute honesty, and never once demanded specialized or preferential treatment from the governing state. Following a calculated pause, Patel executed a seamless rhetorical pivot, mirroring the fluid transition a seasoned trial attorney employs when shifting from a compelling opening statement to the rigorous demands of direct witness examination. He noted that since the representative had explicitly introduced the topic of the immigrant community's experiences into the official record, he wished to pivot the discussion toward a rigorous examination of her own documented immigration history. A subtle tightening became visible along Omar's jawline as she immediately interjected, asserting forcefully that her personal history held absolutely no relevance to the established parameters of the morning's oversight hearing. Patel calmly countered her objection, pointing out that she had actively questioned him regarding the fundamental fairness and integrity of his agency's investigations. He stated that he was directly answering her inquiry by demonstrating that a mutual desire for accountability must necessarily begin with an examination of her own public record. Without breaking eye contact, he unclasped the leather briefcase and meticulously extracted a specific, slender folder. It was highly organized, featuring precisely color-coded tabs, the unmistakable organizational system of a legal professional who had exhaustively prepared a comprehensive evidentiary portfolio. Reading from the compiled documents, he stated that in the year 2002, she had entered into a religious matrimonial union, specifically a ceremonial faith-based commitment, rather than a legally recognized state marriage, with an individual named Ahmed Hirsi, a relationship that subsequently produced 3 children. He then advanced the timeline to 2009, noting that while she reportedly maintained her ongoing relationship with Mr. Hirsi, she simultaneously entered into a separate, legally binding marriage, formally registered with civil authorities, with a different individual identified as Ahmed Noor Saeed Elmi. Methodically turning to the next page of his dossier, Patel detailed that Mr. Elmi was an individual holding British citizenship. He noted that shortly following the formalization of their legal marriage, Mr. Elmi successfully matriculated at North Dakota State University, which he explicitly noted was the Congresswoman's own collegiate alma mater. Following Mr. Elmi's academic graduation in 2012, Patel's records indicated a relocation to the city of Minneapolis, where publicly accessible municipal housing databases suggested he resided within a subsidized public housing facility prior to facing formal eviction proceedings, after which he reportedly relocated back to the United Kingdom. Turning yet another page, the director highlighted that in the year 2011, the Congresswoman and Mr. Elmi experienced a separation, yet they entirely failed to finalize a legal dissolution of the marriage until the year 2017, a deeply extended duration of 6 complete years. During this specific 6-year interim, specifically referencing the tax years of 2014 and 2015, Patel stated that federal records demonstrated she had improperly filed joint federal income tax returns with Mr. Hersey, the individual she concurrently resided with. Despite remaining legally wed to Mr. Elmi, he further cemented this point by citing that the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board had independently investigated and officially confirmed this specific regulatory violation, resulting in her payment of a $500 administrative penalty and the mandatory submission of amended financial returns. Closing the folder without returning it to the table, Patel held the physical document as he posed a highly direct question. He politely inquired as to the exact number of siblings the Congresswoman possessed. This seemingly innocuous query dropped into the tense atmosphere of the chamber like a heavy stone plunging into a completely still body of water. The question was structurally simple and conceptually direct, yet everyone present understood that her subsequent response, or more accurately, her potential refusal to provide a substantive answer, would communicate everything the assembled audience needed to comprehend. She swiftly dismissed the inquiry as a thoroughly debunked conspiratorial narrative. Patel remained unyielding, clarifying that he was absolutely not introducing complex conspiracy theories, but rather asking a fundamental, verifiable question regarding her family structure. He insisted it was a strictly factual inquiry, requiring a strictly numerical response. Reluctantly, she stated that she was the youngest sibling among 7 children. Patel immediately followed up, pressing her to confirm whether the aforementioned Ahmed Nur Said Elmi was officially recognized as one of those 7 specific siblings. She vehemently denied the assertion, labeling it entirely baseless. Patel smoothly countered that the most efficient method to dispel such baseless assertions would be the immediate provision of certified birth records, which would instantly resolve the lingering public ambiguity. He reminded her that independent investigative journalists, political ethics auditors, and formal representatives of the House Ethics Office had persistently presented this exact question to her for an entire decade. Throughout that extended 10-year period, he noted, she had consistently refused to produce the requested vital documentation, persistently declined to make her extended family members available for journalistic interviews, and steadfastly withheld her complete historical immigration files from public scrutiny. Gently resting the controversial folder upon the table, Patel adopted a more philosophical tone. He stated that during his extensive tenure as a defense attorney, representing hundreds of diverse clients, he had internalized a fundamental psychological truth universally recognized by criminal litigators. Individuals who possess genuine innocence maintain a burning desire to affirmatively prove their blamelessness. They eagerly volunteer exonerating documents, actively present corroborating witnesses, and willingly submit exculpatory evidence. Conversely, he observed, only those individuals who harbor something significant they wish to conceal actively choose the strategic path of sustained silence. Omar leaned aggressively forward, the volume of her voice escalating, though not quite reaching a full shout. Instead, it hit the specific, resonant pitch of genuine, unvarnished indignation. A deeply different energetic frequency than carefully rehearsed political outrage. She forcefully accused the director of launching a coordinated personal attack strictly motivated by her intersectional identity as a black Muslim woman. Patel's vocal register, however, entirely refused to elevate to match her rising emotional intensity. His tone remained perfectly anchored in its previous state, exceptionally low, deeply tranquil, and surgically precise. He calmly reiterated that his own father had suffered brutal expulsion from the African continent explicitly due to his racial presentation. He noted his father's dual Indian and African heritage, while simultaneously highlighting his own identity as a practicing Hindu currently serving as the chief executive of the FBI, a position of immense institutional power that, historically speaking, would never have been granted to an individual sharing his ethnic background a century prior. He remarked with subtle irony that he proudly celebrated the Diwali festival while operating within a headquarters facility bearing the name of J. Edgar Hoover. Holding her gaze with unbroken intensity, he firmly instructed her to entirely abandon attempts to deploy a narrative of specialized victimization against him, assuring her with absolute certainty that such a tactic would prove entirely ineffective. A profound silence enveloped the public gallery. It was the specific, heavy quietude that inevitably descends upon a room immediately following the deployment of a highly precise rhetorical weapon, not an explosive or theatrical device, but an instrument of surgical precision that inflicts a remarkably clean and undeniable wound. The committee chairman cast a brief glance toward the digital timekeeping device mounted on the chamber wall. Exactly 26 minutes had elapsed since the proceedings commenced. In the context of a standard legislative oversight hearing, 26 minutes would barely have provided sufficient time to conclude the mandatory opening statements and perhaps initiate the very first sequence of polite, introductory questions. Today, however, those initial 26 minutes had proven more than adequate to comprehensively exhume deeply contested immigration timelines, expose complex historical tax discrepancies, highlight highly scrutinized marital histories, and vividly illuminate the sustained, decade-long silence of a sitting federal legislator regarding a fundamental biographical question that could ostensibly be resolved through the presentation of a single sheet of certified paper. The Congresswoman remained entirely silent for 8 full seconds. While 8 seconds may seem inconsequential in daily life, within the hyper-scrutinized environment of a live congressional broadcast, with multiple high-definition cameras recording every micro-expression and the C-SPAN network transmitting the feed to political offices, national newsrooms, and countless private residences across the country, an 8-second pause feels as vast and unbridgeable as a geological canyon. Relying on her extensive political experience, she forcefully stepped in to fill the expanding conversational void. Recognizing the severe optical danger of allowing dead air to persist, attempting to aggressively retake control of the narrative momentum, Omar suggested they forcefully redirect the ongoing dialogue back to the ostensible primary focus of the morning's oversight gathering. She pivoted to sharply criticize the operational culture of the Bureau under his current leadership, asserting that numerous, seasoned, career-level field agents had publicly characterized the agency as having become deeply politicized and systematically weaponized against domestic ideological opponents. She began to reference multiple whistleblowers who had reportedly approached legislative committees with grievances. Patel interjected smoothly, his voice carrying the calm but immovable finality of a heavy oak door, swinging gently but securely shut. He suggested that, if the committee genuinely desired to engage in a comprehensive discussion regarding institutional and financial accountability, They should appropriately commence that dialogue by examining a specific monetary figure, $2,780,000. Reaching back into the depths of his briefcase, he produced a second, distinct folder. Consulting its contents, he noted that in the year 2020, the representative had formalized a marriage with an individual named Tim Minett, whom he identified as a professional political consultant. He further detailed that Mr. Minett served as the principal operator of a private consulting enterprise, legally incorporated as the E Street Group. Patel methodically outlined that during the course of the Congresswoman's 2020 congressional re-election campaign, this specific consulting firm, managed by her spouse, had been the direct recipient of consecutive financial contracts originating from her political campaign apparatus, cumulatively totaling the precise sum of $2,780,000. He noted that official regulatory filings categorized these substantial financial disbursements under broad operational headings, including digital marketing strategies, fundraising advisement services, and logistical mail production and postage expenses. He permitted the sheer magnitude of the financial figure to resonate momentarily within the quiet chamber. He verbally summarized the transaction. Nearly $3 million transferred directly from a federal candidate's donor-funded campaign accounts into a private corporate entity managed by the very individual who simultaneously served as both her chief campaign strategist and her legal husband. He continued, noting that an official complaint regarding these transactions was subsequently registered with the Federal Election Commission. Following this regulatory scrutiny, he stated, her campaign apparatus officially terminated its financial relationship with her spouse's firm in November of the election year. Notably, after the electoral contest had concluded and the vast majority of the funds had already been successfully transferred. He highlighted that her campaign's official public rationale for this abrupt termination was an expressed desire to entirely eliminate any perceived ethical conflicts. Pausing to emphasize the specific terminology, he noted the distinction between a perceived ethical dilemma and an actual financial impropriety. Turning a subsequent page in the dossier, Patel introduced a deeply personal, yet legally documented, line of inquiry. He asked if, prior to formalizing her marriage to the consultant, she had been made fully aware that his previous spouse had explicitly stated within sworn, publicly accessible divorce filings that the dissolution of their prior marriage was directly precipitated by an alleged romantic entanglement involving the Congresswoman herself. Immediately behind the representative, her assembled legislative staff members exhibited small, entirely involuntary physical movements, shifting nervously in their assigned seating. It was the distinct, uncontrollable physical reaction, characteristic of professionals who clearly recognize the devastating trajectory of an opponent's legal questioning, but possess absolutely no institutional mechanism to halt its progression. Omar attempted to quickly deflect, asserting that the details of her private, personal relationships were strictly off-limits and irrelevant. Patel immediately countered, his voice adopting the colder, more detached cadence of an investigator presenting undeniable financial ledgers. He firmly asserted that the very moment she authorized the transfer of nearly $3 million in constituent-donated campaign funds to her husband's private corporate entity, the intimate details of her personal life irrevocably transformed into a matter of legitimate, public and financial interest for the citizens who had funded her political ambitions. Advancing to the next documented exhibit, Patel prepared to introduce further financial irregularities. In 2023, he noted, her formally submitted congressional financial disclosure documentation officially represented her total combined personal assets and annual income as being generally consistent with a comprehensive net worth hovering approximately around the figure of $158,002. Concurrently, he pointed out, this exact same sworn document publicly disclosed, carrying a combined burden of consumer credit card debt and educational student loans estimated to fall somewhere between $45,000 and $150,000. He paused briefly to allow this baseline financial portrait to fully register with the committee members. He then vividly contrasted this initial baseline with the data contained within her subsequent disclosure form, filed a mere 12 months later, in 2024. This newly updated document, he revealed, dramatically listed her husband's newly acquired equity position within a private venture capital enterprise, specifically identified as Rose Lake Capital, evaluating that single asset at a staggering range, somewhere between $5 million and $25 million. Furthermore, he noted, the same disclosure indicated an additional ownership stake in a California-based viticulture enterprise known as Est Crew, assessing its value between $1 million and $5 million. Visually emphasizing the disparity, he placed the two printed financial declarations side by side upon the wooden surface of the table. He starkly summarized the economic trajectory, an inexplicable personal financial evolution, shifting from a modest net worth of $158,000 to a potential high-end valuation, approaching $30 million within a single 12-month calendar cycle. Directing his attention specifically toward the presiding committee chair, Patel quoted the chairman's own previously expressed public skepticism regarding these specific filings, noting the chairman's disbelief as a seasoned financial professional regarding the mathematical plausibility of such an explosive accumulation of wealth. Returning his focused gaze to the Congresswoman, Patel methodically introduced deeper irregularities regarding the specific corporate entities in question. He revealed that according to obtained banking records, the corporate accounts associated with the highly valued Rose Lake Capital contained a total balance of exactly 5 cents during the year 2023. He repeated the minuscule figure for emphasis before noting that, inexplicably, during the immediately subsequent calendar year, this exact same corporate shell was officially valued on congressional disclosure forms at an astonishing $25 million. Shifting his analytical focus to her husband's secondary business venture, the California winery, Patel stated that the enterprise was currently deeply embroiled as the primary defendant in a comprehensive civil fraud litigation. This legal action, he detailed, had been formally initiated by an aggrieved financial backer named Naeem Mahmood, whose civil complaint formally alleged that he had been explicitly guaranteed a highly lucrative 200% return on a substantial initial capital investment of $300,000, yet had ultimately received absolutely zero financial compensation or return on his investment. Closing the second folder, Patel added a final, highly calculated observation regarding the underlying nature of these specific commercial ventures. He stated that he felt compelled to highlight a specific operational detail not due to its strict legal relevance, but rather because it pertained directly to broader questions of public character and philosophical consistency. He noted that her husband's primary commercial enterprise centered on the agricultural production and commercial distribution of alcoholic beverages. He respectfully acknowledged that the representative was widely known as a deeply devout practitioner of the Islamic faith, a religious tradition that unequivocally prohibits the manufacture, commercial sale, and personal consumption of intoxicating substances. He carefully prefaced his upcoming critique by stating his firm belief that an individual's personal religious convictions are an inherently private matter, strictly between themselves and the divine. However, he forcefully argued, when a prominent public official routinely utilizes their religious identity as a defensive political mechanism to deflect valid legislative criticism, while their immediate household simultaneously derives massive financial profit from the commercial distribution of a product that their professed faith explicitly forbids. Such behavior transcends the simple bounds of standard political hypocrisy. Pausing dramatically and dropping his vocal register to its most resonant depth, he concluded the thought by asserting that such a contradiction instead represents a highly calculated, cynical business model, a complex, difficult to categorize. Sonic wave rippled through the assembled public gallery. It was not the sound of genuine amusement or open laughter, but rather the collective, pressurized exhalation of hundreds of individuals who had suddenly heard a deeply held, previously unspoken suspicion articulated with devastating clarity in a highly public forum. The chairman tapped his wooden gavel exactly once, not with overwhelming force, but with precisely enough authority to re-establish procedural order within the volatile room. Throughout this intense exchange, Representative Omar remained seated firmly behind her official desk placard. Her hands remained completely immobilized, and the musculature of her face maintained a highly disciplined, stoic composure. However, her eyes, the specific, uncontrollable physiological indicators that stationary broadcast cameras expertly capture, while static written transcripts inevitably fail to convey, betrayed the deep, sudden realization of a seasoned political operator who finally comprehends that the defensive witness she had confidently intended to relentlessly interrogate had entirely reversed the prevailing power dynamics, effectively transforming himself into a deeply aggressive and highly effective prosecuting attorney. Within the highly specialized arena of legal cross-examination, there exists a subtle, underlying rhythmic structure that is truly understood only by the most experienced trial attorneys. It is fundamentally distinct from the natural, equitable rhythm of standard human conversation, which relies upon a mutual, cooperative exchange of ideas and a balanced negotiation between two equal participants. The rhythm of a courtroom cross-examination is, conversely, the absolute rhythm of psychological and narrative control. Within this specific dynamic, the designated questioner unilaterally dictates the conversational tempo, exclusively selects the topical direction of the inquiry, and independently determines precisely when to aggressively advance an argument, when to strategically pause for dramatic effect, and when to deliver a decisive rhetorical strike. In this highly structured environment, the individual seated at the witness table is never considered an equal partner in a mutual dialogue. Rather, they are the strictly constrained subject of a highly directed, adversarial inquiry. Kash Patel possessed an intrinsic, almost cellular understanding of this specific conversational rhythm, possessing the same intuitive mastery that a highly trained percussionist demonstrates toward complex musical time signatures. It was not merely an intellectual comprehension, but a deeply ingrained physical reality, manifesting in the precise manner his vocal inflections strategically rose and fell, his calculated use of devastating silence, and his relentless forward momentum. This highly specialized skill set was not acquired in comfortable academic settings, but had been forged in the high-stakes crucibles of Miami-Dade County's criminal courts, where he had fiercely defended individuals facing severe homicide charges and where deploying an incorrect inquiry at a critical juncture could easily spell the tragic difference between a client's ultimate liberty and a sentence of permanent incarceration. He had subsequently honed and refined this aggressive methodology during his tenure at the Department of Justice, systematically interrogating and dismantling the operational networks of international terrorists. Now, he was expertly deploying this formidable, accumulated experience within the confines of Chamber 2154, directing it against a powerful sitting congresswoman who had grown entirely accustomed to occupying the position of unchallenged interrogator and who was currently discovering, with each passing minute, that the fundamental rules of congressional engagement had been drastically and irrevocably altered. Attempting to forcefully reclaim the lost conversational initiative, Omar leaned heavily into her desktop microphone, adopting the aggressive physical posture of a seasoned debater who had consciously decided to abandon a failing defensive strategy in favor of a direct offensive assault. With her shoulders squared forward, her chin tilted slightly upward, and her vocal pitch strategically elevated to project maximum institutional authority, she addressed the director. She asserted that since he appeared entirely determined to transform the current oversight hearing into a personalized referendum regarding her character, rather than focusing upon the structural investigation he was supposedly managing, she felt compelled to directly address his own controversial professional history. She pointedly reminded the committee that Patel was the primary author of the highly controversial Nunes Memo, a deeply contested intelligence document that numerous seasoned professionals within the national security apparatus had publicly decried as fundamentally misleading and which had faced widespread public condemnation as a deeply partisan effort designed specifically to undermine and attack the integrity of the federal investigation regarding alleged Russian electoral interference. She boldly proclaimed that the director possessed a deeply documented, highly public history of routinely weaponizing his various institutional positions to further specific, partisan political agendas. She concluded her counterattack by suggesting that before he presumed to aggressively question her fundamental personal integrity, he would be significantly better served by undertaking a rigorous examination of his own highly questionable professional record. From a purely rhetorical perspective, it was undoubtedly the most forceful and coherent argument she had successfully articulated throughout the entire morning session. However, from a strictly tactical standpoint, it represented a catastrophic miscalculation as it inadvertently opened a specific conversational door that Patel had been patiently waiting for an opportunity to walk through. Expressing polite gratitude that the representative had chosen to introduce the topic of the controversial Nunes Memo into the ongoing debate, Patel immediately capitalized on the opening. He swiftly reminded the committee that the highly respected Inspector General of the Department of Justice, Michael Horowitz, had subsequently conducted an exhaustive, independent review of the FBI's deeply sensitive Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act applications. He highlighted that this rigorous, independent audit had conclusively identified exactly 17 distinct, highly significant structural errors and material omissions within those critical judicial applications. He emphasized the number 17 to ensure its gravity was understood. He then smoothly connected this verified finding back to the document he had authored, noting that the memo he had helped draft had specifically sought to identify and expose those exact same institutional abuses and that the independent Inspector General had ultimately confirmed the precise validity of his initial concerns. With a deeply subtle, highly calculated smile, the specific, understated expression that briefly illuminates the face of a seasoned litigator. When the opposing counsel inadvertently introduces a piece of evidence that devastatingly undermines their own core argument, he expressed his sincere appreciation that she had brought the matter to the committee's attention. However, Patel continued, since the Congresswoman had explicitly introduced the subject of controversial public statements and political rhetoric into the official dialogue, he expressed a strong desire to immediately pivot the conversation toward a rigorous examination of her own extensively documented history of highly inflammatory public remarks. Reaching back into his case, he carefully extracted a third, distinctly separate folder. This particular file was noticeably thinner than its predecessors, yet Patel handled it with a remarkably heightened degree of deliberate caution, mirroring the delicate reverence an experienced prosecutor employs when physically presenting the singular piece of explosive physical evidence, guaranteed to permanently alter a jury's fundamental perception of an ongoing trial. Opening the slim file, he directed the committee's attention to the specific date of November 2012. He stated that during this period, she had published a specific message on a widely utilized social media platform, explicitly noting that he was currently reading verbatim from the permanently archived, publicly accessible digital record. He recited the historical quote, stating that the nation of Israel had successfully hypnotized the entire global community, followed by a religious invocation, requesting divine intervention to awaken the populace and assist them in clearly perceiving what she characterized as the evil doings of the Israeli state. Patel forcefully repeated the specific word she had chosen to employ, hypnotized. He then provided critical historical context, explaining to the assembled audience that the specific rhetorical trope suggesting individuals of Jewish heritage possess the unnatural ability to manipulate or control global populations through dark, almost mystical powers represents one of the most ancient, deeply entrenched, and profoundly harmful anti-Semitic narratives documented throughout recorded human history. He emphasized the severe gravity of this language by noting that its usage severely predates the horrors of the Holocaust and was frequently deployed as a core component of state-sponsored Nazi propaganda campaigns. He concluded this specific point by expressing profound dismay that she, an elected, sitting member of the United States Congress, had consciously chosen to broadcast this highly offensive historical trope across a massive public platform. Turning to the subsequent page within the file, Patel advanced the historical timeline to February of the year 2019. He detailed that, while publicly responding to a direct inquiry regarding the underlying motivations driving American political support for the State of Israel, she had published another controversial statement, which he again quoted directly from the established public record. He recited her assertion that the entirety of the geopolitical dynamic was fundamentally all about the Benjamins, baby. He immediately deconstructed the specific slang terminology utilized, explaining that Benjamins serves as a common colloquialism, referring to $100 denominations of American currency. He thoroughly analyzed the underlying implication of her statement, arguing that it explicitly advanced the deeply harmful narrative that continued American diplomatic and financial support for the Israeli state was effectively being purchased outright through the strategic deployment of Jewish financial wealth, once again providing necessary historical context. He firmly stated that the specific trope associating individuals of Jewish descent with the unethical purchasing of vast political influence remains one of the most widely recognized and deeply damaging anti-Semitic canards present within the modern political discourse. Flipping to yet another page, Patel highlighted a subsequent incident that occurred a mere 3 weeks later, specifically citing the date of the 27th of February 2019. He noted that on this occasion, she had made a deeply controversial public declaration regarding the nature of political influence within the United States, expressing her intense desire to confront specific political forces that, in her view, promoted the idea that it was entirely acceptable to actively demand that American citizens pledge their fundamental allegiance to a foreign sovereign entity. Patel immediately identified and deconstructed the core rhetorical component of her statement, the explicit accusation of holding an allegiance to a foreign country. He carefully explained that this specific accusation represents the classic dual loyalty trope, the deeply insidious, historically persistent claim that Jewish American citizens harbor a deeper, superseding loyalty toward the foreign state of Israel than toward the constitutional Republic of the United States. He forcefully emphasized that this specific, deeply damaging narrative has been historically weaponized by authoritarian regimes to justify the severe systemic persecution of Jewish populations across multiple centuries of global history. Having systematically presented these three distinct historical examples, Patel placed the documents back upon the table. He starkly summarized the evidentiary record, three entirely separate, highly documented public incidents, each involving the explicit deployment of deeply established, historically sensitive tropes associated with profound prejudice. He highlighted the severity of her actions by noting that even her own political faction, the Democratic Party, felt compelled to formally introduce a legislative resolution explicitly condemning the nature of her remarks. He further noted that Representative Eliot Engel, who at the time served as the esteemed chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, had publicly categorized her statements as being deeply and profoundly offensive. Finally, he recounted the ultimate legislative consequence of her rhetoric, stating that in February of the year 2023, the entire House of Representatives engaged in a formal floor vote, resulting in a narrow 218 to 211 decision to officially strip her of her prestigious committee assignments and remove her from the Foreign Affairs Committee. Following this comprehensive recitation of facts, Patel paused, and a profound shift occurred in the fundamental quality of his voice. Throughout the preceding 40 minutes of the exhaustive hearing, he had communicated utilizing the highly controlled, almost sterile precision, characteristic of a master attorney, his sentence structures perfectly measured, his personal emotions rigorously compartmentalized, and every chosen word strategically deployed with the calculated deliberateness of a grandmaster maneuvering pieces across a complex chessboard. Now, however, for the very first time during the proceedings, a new, distinct element entered his vocal delivery. It was not simple, raw anger, but rather an emotion considerably more complex and inherently more dangerous. It was the specific, resonant quality of a deeply experienced individual who has personally witnessed the exact horrors he is preparing to describe and who fundamentally understands that the sheer weight of the memory itself is entirely sufficient, entirely negating the need for any artificial rhetorical enhancement. He announced to the quieted room that he now wished to discuss the catastrophic events of September 11th. The atmosphere within the chamber instantly constricted. In the broader context of American public life, those two specific words possess a unique, incredibly dense gravitational mass that is entirely unmatched by any other date on the calendar. Their mere invocation actively warps the conversational atmosphere around them, instantly altering the physical posture and psychological state of every individual within earshot. Up in the public gallery, a woman seated in the second row slowly closed her eyes, seeking a moment of private reflection. Several rows behind her, a man forcefully gripped the wooden armrest of his chair. Patel proceeded to state the grim historical fact. 2,977 individual human beings violently perished on the morning of the 11th of September, 2001. He shared a deeply personal connection to the tragedy, noting that he had spent his formative years residing on Long Island, New York, and vividly recalling that he could clearly observe the massive, dark plumes of smoke rising from the collapsing towers across the horizon. He shared painful personal memories, noting that several of his childhood classmates had tragically lost their parents during the attacks, and that close personal friends of his own family had simply never returned home from their workplaces that day. His voice remained incredibly low, not artificially soft, but anchored in a deeply resonant register characteristic of a man who is actively, and only barely successfully, restraining a massive reserve of profound internal emotion. He continued his narrative, explaining that following those tragic events, he eventually transitioned his career to serve as a specialized terrorism prosecutor, operating within the highest echelons of the Department of Justice. In this demanding capacity, he detailed his extensive experience successfully prosecuting highly dangerous individuals directly affiliated with complex international terrorist syndicates, actively operating across regions in East Africa and within the domestic borders of the United States. He noted his close, operational coordination with elite special operations military forces emphasizing that he had personally sat across interrogation tables and stared directly into the eyes of radicalized individuals who harbored a burning, consuming desire to annihilate American citizens. He firmly asserted that his profound understanding of the nature of international terrorism was not derived from watching sanitized television broadcasts or studying abstract academic textbooks, but was instead forged through the grueling reality of reviewing gruesome case files, navigating tense federal courtrooms, and personally engaging with the shattered faces of the grieving families left behind. Directing his gaze entirely upon Representative Omar, he locked eyes with her and adamantly refused to break the intense connection. He then transitioned to another highly scrutinized public event from her past. He noted that in March of the year 2019, she had delivered a featured address at a major gathering hosted by the Council on American Islamic Relations. He detailed that during the course of her speech, while discussing the organizational history and founding of that specific advocacy group in the chaotic aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, she had chosen to describe the single most devastating act of foreign terrorism ever perpetrated upon American soil, an event resulting in the violent murder of nearly 3,000 individuals by utilizing a phrase consisting of exactly 5 deeply dismissive words. He allowed a heavy silence to hang in the air before repeating the specific phrase she had employed. Some people did something. The repetition of those 5 specific words landed within the expansive chamber with the profound, echoing weight of a massive stone dropped onto the stone floor of a silent cathedral. The impact was not a result of increased volume, but rather the sheer, undeniable precision of the callback. Virtually every individual present in the room was already intimately familiar with the controversial quote. They had previously engaged in heated debates regarding its intent, having either passionately defended its context or vehemently condemned its apparent callousness. However, hearing those exact words repeated within this highly specific, deeply serious environment, delivered by an experienced federal prosecutor who had dedicated a significant portion of his professional life to hunting down and incarcerating the exact type of individuals who had perpetrated the horrific attacks, caused the phrase to resonate with an entirely new and devastating frequency. They sounded exactly as profoundly dismissive and fundamentally damning as their harshest critics had long maintained. He challenged the inherent absurdity of her phrasing, questioning how 19 highly trained, heavily armed al-Qaeda operatives hijacking commercial airliners could ever be accurately categorized simply as some people. He further questioned how the meticulously coordinated, systematic slaughter of thousands of innocent civilians could possibly be reduced to the vague, inconsequential descriptor of something. He expressed deep indignation at the implied suggestion that the catastrophic collapse of the World Trade Center towers, the massive conflagration at the Pentagon, and the desperate struggle of the passengers aboard the doomed flight that crashed into a Pennsylvania field could somehow be accurately summarized with the rhetorical equivalent of an indifferent shrug. As he continued, the fundamental quality of his voice grew noticeably harder. It was not an increase in sheer decibel level, but rather the acquisition of a distinct metallic edge, the unyielding hardness characteristic of forged iron rather than amplified sound. He reiterated his extensive professional background, noting that he had built comprehensive, airtight federal cases against highly dangerous operatives who actively recruited foot soldiers, secured illicit financing, and provided ideological inspiration for violent attacks targeting the American homeland. He forcefully clarified that such organized violence does not merely constitute an abstract something, but rather represents an active state of war, and he unequivocally defined the individuals responsible not merely as some people, but as determined, lethal enemies of the state. He finally released her intense gaze, taking a single, deep, remarkably measured breath. When he resumed speaking, his vocal tone had incredibly returned to the highly controlled, perfectly modulated cadence of the professional litigator, appearing as if the intense, raw emotion of the preceding minute had been a distinct, separate room he had briefly entered, observed, and firmly secured the door behind him. He concluded his critique of her rhetoric by noting the profound irony of her situation. She currently occupied a seat of immense institutional power within the United States Congress, proudly wearing the prestigious title bestowed upon her by the nation, actively drawing a substantial salary entirely funded by the American taxpayer, and enjoying the absolute protection of a complex constitutional framework that countless American service members had sacrificed their lives to defend. Yet, despite enjoying all of these immense privileges, she had somehow found it appropriate to casually trivialize the tragic memory of thousands of murdered citizens using a mere 5 words. Methodically, he placed the third, slender folder atop the growing stack of evidentiary materials on his desk. The accumulated pile now consisted of 3 distinct files, representing 3 comprehensive categories of inquiry, collectively constructing a formidable, undeniable architecture of documented evidence. The atmosphere in the room had subtly transformed. The proceedings were no longer perceived as a standard, politically motivated oversight hearing, but had instead adopted the stark, undeniable gravity of a high-stakes legal prosecution. Patel casually reached for his glass of water, taking a slow, deliberate drink, before gently returning it to the table. This simple physical action was highly intentional, a classic, thoroughly refined courtroom technique specifically designed to artificially reset the collective attention of the room following a deeply emotional exchange. He understood that juries, much like public audiences, require distinct psychological transitions. The carefully managed pause between an emotional peak and the subsequent introduction of dry, factual data is the precise mechanism that allows both elements to successfully resonate. When he finally spoke again, his voice possessed an icy, detached quality. This was not the theatrical, exaggerated coldness frequently adopted by fictional villains, nor was it the manufactured, artificial coldness often deployed by defensive politicians. Rather, it was the highly functional, operational coldness of an experienced professional swiftly returning to the demanding task at hand, immediately after permitting himself a brief, tightly controlled moment of profound human empathy. He suggested they pivot the conversation back to the primary, official reason for their current gathering: the deeply troubling situation unfolding within the state of Minnesota. For the 4th consecutive time, he unlatched his briefcase, extracting the final and noticeably thickest folder from its interior. This specific file was incredibly dense, packed tightly with complex financial spreadsheets, copies of legal indictments, and various organizational charts that had been condensed onto printed pages. He began to systematically detail the structural parameters of the alleged fraud, introducing the organization known as Feeding Our Future. He noted that the entity had been formally established by an individual named Amy Bach in the year 2016. He proceeded to outline the core allegations, stating that during the height of the global COVID-19 pandemic, this specific organization had aggressively claimed to have successfully distributed millions of nutritious meals to vulnerable school children by heavily utilizing funds provided through the Federal Child Nutrition Program. However, he starkly revealed that exhaustive federal audits and investigations had subsequently determined that the actual, a verifiable number of meals distributed to the community constituted a mere 3% of the massive figures the organization had officially claimed on their federal reimbursement forms. The remaining 97% of the allocated funds, representing a staggering total of $250 million in vital federal subsidies, had been systematically and illicitly siphoned away. He allowed the sheer magnitude of the financial figure to hang in the silent room. He then detailed the immense scale of the subsequent federal law enforcement response, noting that 78 separate individuals had ultimately been formally indicted in connection with the sprawling scheme, with more than 50 of those defendants having already entered official guilty pleas regarding their illegal actions. He further noted that Ms. Bach, the organization's founder, had been successfully convicted on serious charges of federal wire fraud. Highlighting the extreme audacity of the financial diversion, Patel detailed how the various defendants had brazenly utilized the stolen federal funds to finance extravagant, lavish lifestyles, purchasing lucrative lakefront real estate, acquiring fleets of high-end luxury vehicles, amassing collections of expensive jewelry, and frequently utilizing premium-class international travel accommodations. To underscore the sheer obscenity of the theft, he specifically noted that one particular defendant had utilized the stolen funds' money expressly intended to provide basic nutritional sustenance to impoverished children residing in Minneapolis, to casually rent an opulent, private beachfront villa situated in the distant Maldives. Turning to the next section of the voluminous report, Patel issued a grim warning. The massive Feeding Our Future scandal apparently represented merely the initial discovery in a much wider pattern of systemic corruption. He detailed that subsequent, ongoing investigations had successfully uncovered massive, parallel, fraudulent schemes operating within other state-managed social programs. He specifically cited rampant fraud discovered within Minnesota's state-sponsored autism therapy program, estimating the financial losses in that sector to be approximately $220 million. Furthermore, he highlighted deep irregularities within the state's Housing Stabilization Services program, estimating an additional $32 million in fraudulent claims. To summarize the unprecedented scale of the crisis, he directly quoted Joseph Thompson, the acting United States Attorney, who had publicly characterized the situation as a massive, deeply coordinated effort representing staggering, industrial-scale fraud, with the total estimated financial losses rapidly approaching the devastating figure of $1 billion. Locking his gaze onto the representative, he repeated the massive sum, $1 billion. He emphasized that this incomprehensible amount of money had been systematically stolen from vital social programs specifically designed to provide essential nutrition to hungry children, secure stable housing for vulnerable populations, and deliver crucial therapeutic services to autistic youth, residing directly within the geographic borders of the state she represented and deeply impacting the very specific communities she consistently claimed to champion. As Omar visibly opened her mouth, clearly intending to launch a defensive interjection, Patel seamlessly continued his relentless presentation of facts. He did not artificially raise the volume of his voice, nor did he frantically accelerate his speaking cadence. He simply refused to yield the floor, maintaining a steady, unstoppable momentum, akin to the inexorable flow of a deep river, or the absolute certainty of gravitational pull, demonstrating how a meticulously assembled, sequential presentation of verifiable facts generates its own inherent power, entirely negating the need for aggressive rhetorical force. He directed the committee's attention to the specific date of the 11th of March 2020. On this day, he noted, the Congresswoman had formally introduced a piece of legislation known as the Meals Act. He detailed the specific mechanics of the bill, explaining that it was explicitly designed to significantly modify the established operational protocols of the Department of Agriculture's vital food and nutrition programs, specifically aiming to implement broad regulatory waivers regarding the standard oversight requirements typically applied to school meal distribution programs during the chaotic period of pandemic-related educational closures. He argued forcefully that while the legislation may have been presented with benevolent intentions, its practical application resulted in a disastrous relaxation of crucial financial oversight mechanisms, drastically expanded the overall pool of organizations technically eligible to receive massive federal nutrition grants, and ultimately created the exact, highly permissive regulatory environment that the operators of the Feeding Our Future scheme so successfully and ruthlessly exploited. Holding up a printed document for visual emphasis, Patel introduced a specific, deeply troubling example. He named the Safari Restaurant, a commercial establishment physically located within the borders of Minneapolis. Citing official architectural and licensing records, he noted that the restaurant possessed a maximum legal seating capacity of merely 35 patrons. However, he continued, reading directly from federal charging documents, the operators of this extremely modest establishment had audaciously claimed on official reimbursement forms to be successfully preparing and serving an astonishing 18,000 individual meals every single day. He repeated the logistical absurdity. 18,000 meals originating daily from a small kitchen designed to service 35 seats. Lowering the document, he directly addressed the Congresswoman, reminding her that she had previously offered high-profile, public praise regarding the supposed charitable efforts of this specific restaurant. He immediately countered that public endorsement by revealing that the primary owner of the Safari restaurant was currently facing severe federal indictments directly stemming from his alleged, deeply involved role in the broader fraudulent conspiracy. Extracting yet another document from the thick file, Patel pivoted to examine the complex intersection of the massive fraud and her own political campaign finances. He stated that official election records indicated her campaign apparatus had actively received thousands of dollars in financial contributions originating directly from 3 distinct individuals who were subsequently indicted as defendants in the Feeding Our Future case. More troublingly, he noted, 2 of those specific donor defendants were intimately associated with the operations of the aforementioned Safari restaurant, an entity that federal investigators alleged had successfully and fraudulently received approximately $16 million in diverted federal funds. Omar quickly interjected, her vocal delivery highly controlled, exhibiting the heavily practiced, artificial composure of a seasoned political figure deploying a pre-planned crisis management response. She firmly asserted that her campaign organization had immediately and proactively returned the entirety of those specific financial donations the very moment the existence of the FBI's investigation became public knowledge. Furthermore, she claimed that she had actively encouraged all other elected officials to follow her ethical example and divest themselves of any similarly tainted funds, insisting she possessed absolutely no personal involvement in any aspect of the underlying scheme. Patel responded with a deeply calculated phrase. Let me rephrase, Congresswoman. The deployment of this specific, 4-word phrase landed in the room with the undeniable precision of a master artist's signature. It was a classic, deeply ingrained technique. From his extensive professional repertoire, the exact same phrase he had successfully utilized countless times within the humid courtrooms of Miami. Whenever a hostile or evasive witness attempted to successfully dodge a difficult line of questioning, the phrase essentially communicated a clear, unspoken message. He had heard her attempted deflection. He recognized it as an evasion, and he was now preparing to ask the truly devastating underlying question. He acknowledged her assertion, noting that she had, in fact, returned the sum of $7,400. However, he immediately contrasted that relatively minuscule amount with the staggering scale of the underlying crime, reminding her that the total fraud currently under investigation vastly exceeded $250 million. Through quick mental calculation, He pointed out that her returned donations effectively constituted a mathematically insignificant 0.003% of the massive total sum that had been systematically stolen from the community. Furthermore, he highlighted a recent media interview, noting that when pressed by a journalist from Fox News regarding whether she harbored any political regrets concerning her aggressive sponsorship of the Meals Act, the specific legislative vehicle that investigators argued had directly created the highly permissive conditions allowing for the largest incident of pandemic-related financial fraud in American history, she had unequivocally stated, and he quoted her directly, "Absolutely not." Closing the final, voluminous folder, Patel leaned forward to pose a deeply cutting, highly personalized question. He asked her to consider the actual, human victims of the massive fraud. The impoverished, hungry children residing directly within her own congressional district in Minneapolis, the vulnerable youth who were desperately supposed to receive nutritional assistance during a terrifying global pandemic, when educational facilities were shuttered and families were struggling to survive. He challenged her to name them, asking if she possessed any genuine knowledge of their actual identities, or if her detailed knowledge of her constituents was strictly limited to memorizing the names of the wealthy individuals who provided lucrative financial donations to her political campaigns. The public gallery responded with a deeply noticeable physical stirring. It was absolutely not an outbreak of disruptive applause. The presiding chairman would have immediately utilized his gavel to forcefully suppress any such blatant violation of decorum. Rather, it was a much quieter, profoundly more powerful reaction. The simultaneous, collective exhalation of 300 diverse individuals who had just witnessed an incredibly difficult, deeply necessary question being asked. A question they had all been silently waiting for. Someone possessing sufficient authority to finally articulate. Patel carefully placed the fourth and final folder atop the accumulated stack. There were now 4 distinct files, representing 4 highly detailed categories of inquiry. His large leather briefcase was now entirely empty, yet he clearly signaled that he was not quite finished. He was preparing to transition toward an entirely different rhetorical strategy. He executed a subtle physical adjustment, gently moving his desktop microphone approximately 1 inch closer to his face. While this gesture appeared entirely insignificant to the casual observer, it fundamentally altered the subtle acoustics of his vocal projection, rendering his voice noticeably more intimate, significantly more direct, and creating the distinct acoustic illusion that he was no longer addressing a crowded congressional chamber, but rather engaging in a deeply private, one-on-one conversation. This maneuver represented yet another highly refined courtroom technique. When an attorney desires the jury to lean forward and engage deeply with the narrative, they deliberately lower their vocal volume, instinctively drawing the entire room into their confidence. He announced his intention to share a brief, personal narrative with the assembled committee. He explicitly clarified that this story would not focus on complex financial fraud or divisive partisan politics, but would instead illuminate the fundamental, underlying reasons that originally motivated him to pursue a career in the legal profession. As he began to speak, the fundamental quality of his voice shifted once again. It did not become artificially softer, and the trademark precision of the experienced attorney remained entirely intact. But a new, warmer element emerged beneath the surface, a subtle resonance that, upon careful listening, sounded remarkably akin to genuine, profound memory. He transported the audience back to Miami-Dade County, Florida, in the year 2006. He described himself as a 26-year-old, newly minted public defender. He recounted how the local judicial system had assigned him a highly challenging client, a 19-year-old Haitian immigrant who had been formally arrested and charged with serious felony drug trafficking offenses, facing a potential mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years in a state penitentiary. He paused to ensure the gravity of the situation was understood. He detailed the young man's desperate circumstances, noting that the client possessed extremely limited English proficiency. His extended family entirely lacked financial resources, they possessed absolutely no political or social connections, and they certainly could not afford to retain private legal counsel. Consequently, the impersonal judicial bureaucracy functioned exactly as designed, mechanically assigning the complex case to him. A young, relatively inexperienced public defender, the proud son of immigrants, fresh from the halls of law school, heavily burdened with a massive caseload, and carrying a leather briefcase that, he noted with a brief, almost unconscious touch of the object on the table, looked remarkably similar to the one he currently possessed. He recounted his meticulous review of the case file, noting his professional assessment that the state's evidence appeared remarkably weak, highlighting that the primary witnesses provided deeply contradictory testimonies and identifying significant, troubling gaps within the official chain of custody regarding the seized narcotics. Based on this thorough analysis, he formed a strong professional conviction that his young client might actually possess genuine innocence, directing his gaze comprehensively across the entire room, taking in the committee members, the diverse public gallery, and the unblinking lenses of the broadcast cameras. Deliberately avoiding focusing solely on Omar, he detailed the grueling legal battle that ensued. He recounted fighting tenaciously on behalf of his client for 6 exhausting months, enduring 12 separate, highly contentious court appearances, drafting and arguing numerous complex legal motions designed to suppress questionable evidence, and executing rigorous, relentless cross-examinations of every single witness presented by the state prosecution. He proudly revealed the ultimate triumphant conclusion of the arduous process, a formal verdict of full acquittal, officially declaring the young man not guilty of all charges, dropping his vocal register to an incredibly intimate level, not a theatrical whisper. As Kash Patel was not prone to whispering, but rather the deeply resonant, profound register where fundamental truths are spoken, existing in the narrow space beneath elevated rhetoric, and just above absolute silence, he described the deeply emotional aftermath of the verdict. He recounted how the exonerated young man had embraced him tightly, weeping openly in relief, while his overwhelmed mother literally collapsed to her knees upon the hard floor of the courtroom, loudly praising the divine for her son's deliverance. He described his own profound realization in that specific moment, standing there as an Indian American, a practicing Hindu, the proud son of immigrants who had been brutally expelled from the African continent, successfully operating within a humid Florida courtroom. He finally, truly comprehended the fundamental greatness of the American experiment. He articulated that this greatness did not stem from the nation being inherently flawless or the system being perfectly easy to navigate, but rather from the profound constitutional guarantee that even the most impoverished, entirely forgotten, and thoroughly powerless individual residing within its borders possessed the absolute, undeniable, and fiercely protected right to receive a vigorous legal defense against the awesome power of the state. He allowed the profound emotional weight of the memory to fully settle over the silent chamber before executing a masterful, decisive, rhetorical pivot. He forcefully declared that this profound realization was the specific catalyst that drove him to become an attorney, the foundational motivation that eventually led him to join the elite ranks of the Department of Justice, and the core principle that guided him when he was tasked with rigorously investigating the FBI itself, following allegations that the agency had severely abused its immense institutional power. He articulated his deeply held philosophy that immense institutional power, when completely untethered from rigorous accountability, inevitably devolves into tyranny regardless of whether that unchecked power is wielded by a violent international drug cartel or a deeply entrenched bureaucratic federal agency. He concluded this portion of his testimony by firmly asserting that this unyielding commitment to accountability was the exact reason he currently occupied the director's chair at the witness table. Returning his focused, intense gaze directly toward Representative Omar, he noted that the physical distance separating the lower witness table from the elevated congressional dais was perhaps a mere 12 feet. Yet, within that remarkably short physical expanse, absolutely nothing tangible existed. There were no physical barriers, no protective partitions, no defensive shields. There was merely empty air, ambient lighting, and the massive, accumulated psychological weight of every single argument and revelation that had been meticulously presented throughout the preceding hour. Addressing her directly, he summarized his professional background, reiterating his 7 years of grueling service as a public defender. He reminded her that he had routinely defended individuals accused of horrific acts, murderers, international drug traffickers, complex financial criminals, individuals whom the broader societal system was overwhelmingly eager to simply discard and forget. He emphasized that he had fiercely protected their fundamental constitutional rights, not because he believed they inherently deserved deep personal sympathy, but because he possessed an unwavering belief that they fundamentally deserved the rigorous, unbiased judicial process explicitly guaranteed by the Constitution. He paused for exactly 3 seconds, a perfectly calculated duration that provided just enough time for every single individual present within the massive room to unconsciously lean forward in their seats, eagerly anticipating his next statement. When he resumed, he declared his intention to share a final, crucial observation regarding his former clients. He stated with absolute certainty that every single one of those accused individuals, the alleged murderers, the narcotics traffickers, the sophisticated con artists, had possessed the fundamental courage to stand before a presiding judge and directly face the severe criminal charges levied against them. He highlighted their conduct, noting that they had completely refrained from publicly attacking the judge as a racist. They had entirely avoided accusing the prosecuting attorneys of systemic discrimination, and they had never once attempted to claim that the rigorous legal questions directed toward them were secretly motivated by inherent bigotry. Instead, he observed, they had simply stood their ground, provided their answers, and faced the consequences of their actions. His voice suddenly hardened, the metallic edge returning with full force. The genuine warmth that had characterized his recounting of the Miami courtroom story completely evaporated, rapidly replaced by an emotion adjacent to, but distinct from, pure anger. It was the deeply cold, fiercely righteous clarity of a highly experienced investigator who has meticulously measured the exact distance separating fundamental honesty from cynical dishonesty, and conclusively determined that this distance perfectly mirrored the 12 feet currently separating his seat from hers. He delivered his ultimate, devastating critique, bluntly informing the Congresswoman that she had entirely failed to demonstrate that same level of basic accountability. He recounted that for an entire decade, she had been repeatedly, persistently asked highly legitimate questions regarding her complex marital history, her convoluted immigration records, her deeply irregular personal finances, and her highly questionable campaign expenditures. And yet, he noted, for that entire 10-year period, her defensive response had remained entirely static and aggressively dismissive, universally labeling every inquiry as a baseless conspiracy theory, constantly asserting that any criticism was purely motivated by anti-Muslim bias, and endlessly reducing every complex issue to a simplistic narrative of racism. He argued forcefully that she had utilized this exact same defensive wall to deflect every single question, regardless of the massive volume of documented evidence supporting the inquiries. He slowly shook his head, utilizing a highly effective courtroom gesture often employed by defense attorneys during a powerful closing argument when the sheer weight of the presented evidence has spoken for itself, rendering the ultimate verdict an absolute inevitability. He concluded his devastating assessment by stating that the accused killers he had previously defended in Miami possessed a greater degree of fundamental honesty than she currently demonstrated, primarily because they, at the very least, possessed the basic integrity to refrain from falsely pretending to be perpetual victims. The expansive room remained entirely motionless. No one appeared to move, and the audience seemed to collectively hold their breath. The automated C-SPAN broadcast cameras, which had spent the entire morning smoothly tracking back and forth between the director and the representative, finally settled permanently upon Omar's face. Her facial expression remained remarkably composed, showcasing the highly practiced, artificial stoicism of a veteran political figure who had received extensive training in maintaining a calm exterior while under intense public fire. However, her hands, which had previously been resting visibly upon the elevated dais, had subtly retreated to her lap, safely dropping below the camera's sightline, ensuring that no one watching could determine whether they were currently trembling. A fundamental psychological shift had clearly occurred within Ilhan Omar. During the first hour of the contentious hearing, she had confidently operated entirely within a highly familiar, deeply practiced political framework. The exact same strategic framework that had successfully propelled her from the dust of a Kenyan refugee camp to the hallowed halls of the United States Congress. This established framework relied upon three primary, foundational pillars: the aggressive invocation of intersectional identity, the rapid reshaping of any critical narrative, and the immediate deployment of a fierce counterattack. The established operational rules were simple. When facing criticism, invoke a marginalized identity. When questioned on specifics, quickly change the broader narrative. And when feeling politically cornered, immediately launch a vicious attack against the questioner's motives. It was a highly effective, deeply battle-tested strategy that had successfully sustained her through 8 turbulent years of high-profile public life, allowing her to survive numerous political scandals, intense ethics investigations, massive social media controversies, and the unprecedented, sustained hostility of a sitting president. The framework's historic success derived from the fact that it was firmly rooted in undeniable genuine aspects of her biography. She was, in fact, an actual refugee, a practicing Muslim, and a prominent woman of color operating within a massive, historic institution originally constructed by, and historically operated for, individuals who fundamentally did not share her demographic background. Her defensive strategy was not entirely cynical in its origins. It was initially constructed upon a foundation of genuine, lived experience before eventually being weaponized as a highly effective tool for brutal political survival. However, every strategic framework possesses inherent limitations, and the absolute limit of her particular strategy had been violently breached approximately 90 seconds prior. She found herself completely outmaneuvered when a highly competent witness who shared a remarkably similar narrative of familial immigration and displacement, who was similarly the direct descendant of abruptly expelled refugees, who also identified as a person of color, and who concurrently represented a distinct religious minority, had expertly seized every single element of her carefully constructed defensive framework, completely reversed its polarity, utilized it devastatingly against her, and ultimately left her with absolutely no viable rhetorical weapons remaining in her arsenal. She remained silently seated behind her official nameplate for 4 agonizing seconds. When she finally chose to speak, she executed a maneuver she had not attempted throughout the entire preceding morning. She entirely abandoned her previously established, highly structured political framework. Addressing director Patel, her voice carried a noticeably different quality. It was not artificially louder or softer, but rather completely stripped of its usual, heavily polished political varnish. What remained was a raw, unfiltered vocal delivery, the desperate, unvarnished voice of a highly resilient woman who had entirely ceased performing for the cameras and was now actively fighting for her political survival. Leaning aggressively forward, she forcefully placed her hands back upon the wooden dais, her palms pressed flat and her fingers spread wide, adopting the unmistakable physical posture of an individual bracing for a massive, high-impact collision. She launched a blistering, highly personalized counteroffensive. She aggressively dismissed his meticulously organized folders, his highly refined courtroom tactics, and his carefully rehearsed, emotionally manipulative stories regarding his time in Miami. She declared her intention to clearly articulate exactly what she perceived when looking at him. She stated forcefully that she saw a deeply compromised individual who had been purposefully appointed by a deeply vindictive president, entirely consumed by a desire for political revenge. She continued her attack, characterizing him as an individual who had bizarrely authored children's literature explicitly designed to portray himself as a heroic, magical wizard, actively defending a king-like interpretation of Donald Trump. She further accused him of publishing deeply dangerous, highly retaliatory lists, detailing 60 American citizens whom he publicly smeared as government gangsters, expressing profound alarm that such an individual was now inexplicably entrusted with leading the most powerful and influential law enforcement agency currently operating within the nation. She characterized him as an opportunistic grifter who had spent the preceding 2 years heavily utilizing various podcast platforms to actively promote deeply baseless, highly destructive conspiracy theories regarding the integrity of the FBI, noting the severe irony that he now occupied the position of director. Her voice rapidly gained genuine strength and profound momentum. It carried the undeniable power of a seasoned survivor who had been severely cornered in the past and had successfully fought her way out. She fiercely challenged his repeated claims regarding fundamental honesty and institutional integrity. She loudly reminded the committee that he had previously utilized prominent social media platforms to aggressively promote the scientifically debunked, highly dangerous claim that life-saving COVID-19 vaccines produced harmful spike proteins that required immediate detoxification through the consumption of obscure, unverified dietary supplements. She further accused him of actively promoting deeply corrosive, entirely baseless claims regarding widespread electoral fraud. Narratives that she pointedly noted had been comprehensively reviewed and universally rejected by every single legitimate judicial body across the entire American legal landscape. She even highlighted that he had frequently autographed copies of his published works, utilizing recognized slogans directly associated with the deeply radicalized QAnon conspiracy movement. Given this extensive, highly documented history of promoting massive disinformation, she openly questioned how he could possibly expect any member of the Oversight Committee to genuinely believe his current claims of being an entirely impartial, strictly objective federal investigator. Shaking her head in profound disgust, she concluded her aggressive counterattack by declaring that he had absolutely no genuine interest in uncovering objective truth. Rather, she asserted, he was utilizing the hearing strictly as a theatrical platform to perform for a highly specific audience of exactly one incredibly powerful individual currently residing at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. The expansive public gallery instantly erupted into chaos. The reaction was profoundly divided, perfectly mirroring the deep fractures within the room. The left flank of the audience immediately burst into thunderous, sustained applause, vehemently supporting her aggressive counter-narrative. Conversely, The right flank of the gallery remained seated in absolute, stony, furious silence. Meanwhile, trapped in the chaotic center aisle, the assembled press corps scribbled frantically, attempting to capture the explosive exchange. The presiding chairman forcefully slammed his wooden gavel exactly 3 times, eventually succeeding in restoring a fragile semblance of procedural order. However, the fundamental, underlying energy within the chamber had been entirely and irrevocably fractured, violently split along the exact same deep ideological fault lines that currently divided the broader nation. Within that deep fracture, the fiercely partisan supporters on both sides of the aisle successfully found exactly what they had originally come seeking: absolute, unyielding confirmation of their own deeply held, pre-existing political convictions. Throughout the entire explosive outburst and the subsequent chaotic gallery reaction, Patel exhibited absolutely no visible reaction. He did not physically flinch in response to the thunderous applause, nor did he visibly bristle or show defensive anger in response to her barrage of highly personalized accusations. He simply remained seated calmly at the witness table, his hands resting perfectly flat, his facial expression entirely unchanged. He perfectly mirrored the disciplined, professional posture of a highly experienced trial attorney, patiently waiting out an opposing counsel who is currently delivering a highly passionate, deeply emotional closing argument that sounds incredibly compelling to a lay audience, but completely fails to address the actual, underlying evidentiary record. He simply waited for the chaotic energy in the room to slowly dissipate. When the chamber finally settled into an uneasy silence, Patel responded simply, expressing his polite gratitude to the Congresswoman. He calmly asserted that her explosive, highly evasive outburst had just perfectly and comprehensively proven his entire underlying point. Raising a single hand in a highly functional, entirely untheatrical manner, utilizing the simple gesture of a methodical individual preparing to count items on their fingers, he began his final summation. Extending his first finger, he noted that he had asked her a direct, factual question regarding the identity of Ahmed Noor Saeed Elmi, and she had entirely failed to provide a substantive answer. Extending his second finger, he reminded the room that he had inquired about the massive, nearly $3 million financial transfer to her husband's consulting firm, and she had entirely failed to provide a substantive answer. Raising his third finger, he noted her complete lack of response regarding her deeply inexplicable personal financial leap. From a modest net worth to a potential $30 million valuation within a single year. Extending a fourth finger, he highlighted her continued silence regarding her highly controversial "some people did something" remarks concerning the 9/11 attacks. Raising his fifth finger, he pointed out her failure to explain the glaring logistical absurdities surrounding the Safari restaurant's meal claims. Finally, extending his sixth finger, he addressed her defense regarding the tainted campaign donations, noting that while she claimed to have returned the funds, she had entirely failed to address the massive underlying questions regarding the massive, systemic fraud itself. Lowering his hand, he summarized his argument. He stated that he had presented her with 6 highly distinct, entirely factual questions, each one firmly rooted in publicly accessible records, established court documents, sworn financial disclosures, and her own verified public statements. Yet, he observed, instead of providing a single substantive answer to any of these highly legitimate inquiries, she had consciously chosen to launch a blistering series of highly personalized attacks, targeting his character, his political appointment, his published literature, his professional background, and his relationship with the chief executive. Leaning slightly forward, he subtly shrank the physical distance between them by a mere inch. A tiny adjustment that, within the highly charged geometry of a congressional hearing room, effectively bridged the vast gap between the strictly professional and the deeply personal. He informed her that the specific defensive tactic she had just deployed was, in fact, the absolute oldest trick utilized within the criminal defense playbook. He acknowledged his deep familiarity with the strategy, admitting that he had personally employed it numerous times in the past. He explained the underlying psychology of the tactic. When the assembled physical evidence aggressively arraying against a specific client becomes completely overwhelming and undeniable, a competent defense attorney never attempts to directly argue against the ironclad facts. Instead, they actively seek to relentlessly attack the fundamental credibility of the opposing prosecution, desperately attempting to transform the entire legal proceeding into a chaotic referendum on the prosecutor's character rather than a structured examination of the defendant's alleged actions. Straightening his posture, he issued a stern reminder. He noted that their current location was entirely distinct from a standard criminal courtroom located in Miami. They were currently occupying a highly prestigious hearing chamber located within the United States Capitol building, and the ultimate jury evaluating their respective arguments did not consist of 12 random citizens trapped within a wooden box. The true jury, he asserted, consisted of 330 million American citizens actively watching the live broadcast on the C-SPAN network, obsessively reading real-time updates on their mobile devices, and listening closely to the proceedings while commuting in their vehicles. He firmly returned both of his hands to their original, flat position upon the wooden table, consciously readopting the classic, highly transparent posture of the dedicated public defender, ensuring his hands were entirely visible, powerfully signaling that he possessed absolutely nothing to hide from public scrutiny. He delivered his final, decisive statement. Summarizing his extensive professional journey, he reiterated that he had fiercely defended accused individuals, aggressively prosecuted dangerous terrorists, rigorously investigated the FBI during periods of institutional overreach, and was currently leading that exact same agency. He emphasized that throughout every single stage of his lengthy career, spanning from the humid courtrooms of Miami through the powerful corridors of the Department of Justice, into the hallowed halls of Capitol Hill, and ultimately to the executive suite of the Hoover Building, he had consistently adhered to a single, unwavering operational philosophy, relentlessly following the verified evidence, regardless of where it led. Dropping his voice to its absolute lowest, most profound register, he delivered his closing argument. His tone was incredibly clear and entirely unadorned, possessing the undeniable gravity of a final statement that requires absolutely no rhetorical embellishment, because the established facts have already successfully accomplished the heavy lifting. He firmly informed the Congresswoman that the objective, verified evidence possesses absolutely no capacity for empathy or partisan bias. It remains entirely indifferent to her deeply held intersectional identity, just as it remains completely indifferent to his own background. He stressed that the evidentiary record cares absolutely nothing for political party affiliations, the volume of favorable cable news coverage, or the sheer number of followers and individual commands on various social media platforms. The evidence, he stated with absolute finality, simply is what it is. He concluded by assuring the committee that when the massive, ongoing federal investigation eventually reaches its ultimate conclusion, the verified evidence will finally speak for itself. It will not communicate through sensationalized media headlines, carefully crafted public relations press releases, or trending social media hashtags. Instead, it will speak within the solemn confines of federal courtrooms, delivered under the severe penalty of perjury, in an environment where the ultimate truth carries profound, unavoidable consequences. He methodically closed his leather briefcase. The heavy brass clasp engaged with a sharp, highly specific, and deeply final clicking sound. He issued a final, unequivocal declaration. The sweeping federal investigation would relentlessly continue. He assured the room that the series of deeply troubling questions he had raised during the morning session would inevitably receive comprehensive answers. These answers, he clarified, would not be provided by him, nor would they be provided by her, but would instead be delivered entirely by the undeniable weight of the verified evidence. And unlike the Congresswoman, he noted with a final touch of icy disdain, the evidence fundamentally lacks the ability to cowardly hide behind baseless accusations of racism whenever it is confronted with a difficult question. The presiding chairman awkwardly cleared his throat, effectively breaking the massive tension that had engulfed the room. He formally announced that the preceding exchange concluded the committee's highly eventful first round of questioning. He declared a mandatory 15-minute recess before the commencement of the subsequent round, formally thanking the director for providing his exhaustive testimony. Patel offered a brief, respectful nod in response. He slowly stood up from the witness chair, casually picking up his now noticeably lighter briefcase. Its numerous folders had been entirely emptied, their complex contents now permanently entered into the official public record, meticulously distributed across the wooden witness table like a series of devastating exhibits presented during a massive trial that had not yet reached its final verdict, but whose ultimate trajectory was already unmistakably clear to any objective observer. He turned and began walking toward the chamber exit. His physical stride was perfectly even and entirely unhurried, perfectly mirroring the confident, a steady pace of a seasoned trial lawyer, exiting a courtroom following a deeply exhausting but highly successful day of witness testimony. He departed, carrying the profound knowledge that the overarching case was far from officially concluded. There would inevitably be numerous subsequent hearings, countless additional questions to pose, and massive volumes of further documentation to relentlessly review. Yet, he also possessed the absolute certainty that the fundamental narrative trajectory had been irreversibly established. He understood that the deeply damaging evidence, having now been formally presented to the public, could never be successfully retracted or suppressed, and that the fundamental truths he had articulated within that highly monitored room would exist permanently and irrevocably within the official public record. He did not bother to cast a single glance backward as he exited. The heavy wooden door slowly swung shut behind him, sealing with the exact same sharp, highly specific, and deeply final sound as his briefcase clasp. Later that evening, the deep, resonant echoes of the explosive morning hearing manifested as two profoundly different, highly distinct forms of silence descending upon two very different American households. Within the confines of a modern, upscale apartment located on Capitol Hill, Ilhan Omar sat silently, with three of her most trusted senior staff members gathered tightly around a large dining table, entirely covered with open laptops and constantly buzzing smartphones. The large television mounted on the wall was powered on but entirely muted, its closed captioning text relentlessly scrolling across the bottom of the screen. One prominent news network displayed a bright chyron that read, "Patel confronts Omar. FBI director raises marriage fraud and financial questions at oversight hearing." A secondary chyron, flashing across a different, more politically aligned network, offered a counter-narrative, declaring, "Omar fires back. Claims director is performing for an audience of one." Her dedicated press secretary was currently frantically drafting a responsive public statement. The rapidly forming document heavily utilized highly familiar, deeply practiced rhetorical phrasing, repeatedly deploying terms such as politically motivated, racist attacks, and highlighting the continued targeting of a black Muslim woman. It relied entirely upon the exact same architectural framework that virtually every single previous defensive statement had utilized. This strategy was continuously employed because, from a strictly political perspective, the architecture remained highly effective. While it might fail to persuade objective observers who had carefully watched the entirety of the unedited hearing, it remained highly successful at activating her dedicated political base, reassuring her primary financial donors, and feeding the massive ecosystem of friendly, progressive media outlets that could be reliably trusted to significantly amplify her preferred message and successfully reframe the broader narrative before the following morning's news cycle. Omar silently read through the drafted statement. She slowly picked up a pen, preparing to affix her signature to the document. However, she paused momentarily. Gazing out through the large window of her apartment, she observed the city of Washington engaging in its nightly ritual glowing with immense, centralized power. The massive, brilliantly illuminated dome of the Capitol building, lit dramatically from below, appeared to float ethereally against the dark night sky, resembling a massive, glowing lantern of democracy. The various monuments, sprawling memorials, and massive stone and marble architectural triumphs that collectively represented a nation's highly idealized vision of itself were all clearly visible from the elevated window of a woman who had originally arrived within the borders of this massive country as a deeply traumatized 12-year-old refugee fleeing the horrific conditions of a camp in Kenya. She remembered arriving completely unable to speak the English language, sitting silently in a crowded classroom located in Virginia, and painstakingly learning to recite the Pledge of Allegiance purely phonetically, long before she possessed any genuine comprehension of the profound meaning behind the words she was reciting. She still retained scattered memories of the distant refugee camp, not specific, granular details, as those had inevitably faded as childhood memories frequently do, dissolving into vague impressions rather than sharp images. However, she vividly remembered the overwhelming, persistent feeling, the deeply crushing sensation of endless waiting, the profound terror of entirely not knowing whether any viable future actually existed or whether her grim present reality was simply all she would ever experience. She vividly recalled the specific day her father had finally informed her that they had secured passage to America. She remembered the massive airplane, and she distinctly remembered the brutal, a shocking cold of a Minneapolis winter, immediately following a lifetime spent in the sweltering heat of East Africa. A cold so intense it felt like colliding with a solid physical wall. She walked directly into that harsh reality. Yet, she recognized that America had ultimately provided her with virtually everything: full legal citizenship, a robust education, a prominent seat within the state legislature, an incredibly powerful position within the United States Congress, highly coveted appearances on the covers of international magazines, and the direct, undivided attention of sitting presidents. It had provided her with everything she could possibly desire. She directed her gaze back toward the prepared statement, her eyes scanning the highly calculated phrases: politically motivated, racist attacks, continued targeting. For a brief, entirely private moment, visible to absolutely no one else in the room, a complex emotion briefly flickered across her features. It was not genuine guilt, but rather something significantly deeper and more fundamental. Existing just prior to guilt, the faintest, most ephemeral shadow of a profound existential question. Had she genuinely earned the immense privileges that this vast country had so freely provided her? Or had she merely cynically utilized and exploited them? The fleeting moment quickly passed, completely suppressed by years of highly practiced political discipline. She firmly signed the statement and handed it back to her waiting press secretary, issuing a simple, decisive instruction to immediately release it to the press. Meanwhile, miles away, within the suburban landscape of Garden City, Long Island, inside a highly modest residence situated on a remarkably quiet, entirely unassuming street, the exact type of neighborhood where the small front lawns are neatly maintained, but entirely lack manicured perfection, where the parked vehicles are reliably clean, but distinctly lack the prestige of being brand new, and where the core essence of the American dream silently resides in its most profoundly ordinary, and therefore most deeply honest form. Pramod Patel sat quietly in a worn recliner, positioned directly in front of his television set. He was currently 75 years old, his hair having turned entirely white. His hands, the deeply calloused, hard-working hands that had successfully built a highly stable, decades-long career within the complex field of aviation, finance immediately after arriving on American soil, possessing absolutely nothing of value, rested gently upon the padded arms of the chair. They possessed the profound, deep stillness characteristic of an individual who has slowly learned, over the incredibly long course of a highly challenging life, that physical stillness is absolutely not synonymous with passive inaction. He understood that sometimes profound stillness represents the deepest, most powerful form of internal action. Sometimes, utter stillness is the only viable method for an individual to successfully hold the massive weight of their traumatic past and the profound reality of their current present within the exact same fragile moment, without completely breaking apart. His wife quietly entered the room, carrying a steaming cup of tea. She gently placed it upon the small wooden table, situated beside his chair, before silently taking a seat on the adjacent couch. She did not attempt to speak, intuitively understanding that words were entirely unnecessary. They had shared 48 years of marriage, and the complex, unspoken language existing between them had long since transcended the crude necessity of verbal communication. Playing on the television screen before them was a recorded replay of the morning's explosive congressional hearing. They watched intently as their son, Kashyap, the very same boy they had lovingly raised on this exact quiet street, who had spent countless hours riding his bicycle along the nearby concrete sidewalks, who had diligently studied the complexities of criminal justice at the University of Richmond, rigorously pursued legal studies at Pace University, and mastered international law in London, sat confidently at a highly scrutinized witness table situated within the United States Capitol building, firmly declaring to the nation that in America, even the most impoverished, entirely forgotten, and thoroughly powerless individual possesses the absolute, undeniable constitutional right to be vigorously defended. Pramod remained entirely motionless. Beside him, his wife discreetly wiped away silent tears, using the back of her hand. His mind drifted back, vividly remembering the complexities of Uganda. He did not simply remember the traumatic end. He also remembered the genuinely good years, the extended periods when the vibrant Indian community residing in Kampala had been highly prosperous, deeply settled, and entirely secure in their profound belief that the African continent was their permanent home. However, he also vividly remembered the brutal termination of those good years. He specifically remembered the dark days of 1972. He vividly recalled hearing the terrifying, booming voice of Idi Amin broadcasting over the crackling radio, harshly announcing the devastating decree that all individuals possessing Asian heritage had exactly 90 days to completely vacate the country. He remembered the sheer, overwhelming panic that immediately ensued, desperate neighbors frantically loading heavy trucks in the dead of the night, successful family businesses being violently seized by the state, and the terrifying presence of heavily armed soldiers aggressively manning countless checkpoints. He vividly remembered standing in a chaotic airport terminal beside his young wife, clutching their meager remaining belongings not neatly packed in standard suitcases because there simply had not been sufficient time to secure suitcases, but rather hastily stuffed into flimsy cloth bags, holding absolutely whatever they possessed, the physical strength to carry. He remembered boarding the massive airplane. He distinctly remembered gazing down through the small window at the rapidly receding African continent, profoundly understanding with the absolute, devastating certainty that only true, profound loss can provide, that he would absolutely never return. He understood that everything he had painstakingly built over a lifetime was entirely gone, and that his rapidly approaching future was located in a completely unknown country he had never previously visited. Requiring the use of a complex language he currently spoke highly imperfectly, and relying entirely upon a desperate hope that possessed absolutely no tangible evidence to support its existence, save for the numerous, whispered stories he had previously heard regarding a distant, mythical place called America, where people constantly claimed that an individual could genuinely start their life over from scratch. On the television screen, his accomplished son calmly closed his leather briefcase, stood up with profound dignity, and confidently walked out of the massive congressional hearing room. Pramod slowly reached for his cup of tea. He took a long, deliberate drink before gently returning the cup to the table. When he finally chose to speak, it was the very first sentence he had uttered in over an hour. He spoke very quietly, directing his words softly toward his wife, utilizing the Gujarati language, the specific, beautiful language originating from their ancestral village located in the Anand district, the incredibly resilient language that had successfully survived the trauma of Uganda, survived the chaotic, terrifying flight across the ocean, survived the difficult transition to Long Island, and successfully survived 48 years of complex American life. He stated simply, "He did it right." His wife offered a slow, deeply understanding nod. She entirely refrained from asking him to clarify his meaning, because she already knew precisely what he meant. She understood that his simple statement encompassed absolutely everything he meant. The highly successful legal career, the incredibly powerful congressional testimony, and the profoundly impactful words recently spoken in a massive room filled with broadcast cameras. However, she knew that mostly he was referring to the deeper, fundamental thing existing underneath all of those public accomplishments, the specific, profound quality that absolutely never appears in official written transcripts, flashing television chyrons, or highly crafted press releases. It was the specific, deeply recognized quality that a traumatized father who has previously lost absolutely everything instantly recognizes within a son who has subsequently earned absolutely everything: genuine, unyielding integrity. It was the highly specific form of integrity that is absolutely never artificially performed for an audience, but is instead genuinely lived every single day. The kind of profound integrity that initially takes root within a humid courtroom located in Miami ultimately culminates within a massive hearing room located in Washington, and fundamentally belongs entirely to a resilient family that initially arrived on these shores, possessing absolutely nothing, yet managed to build something undeniably real. Simultaneously, located deep within the Cedar Riverside neighborhood, the specific Minneapolis enclave frequently referred to colloquially as Little Mogadishu, where the local commercial storefronts proudly advertise their services utilizing the Somali language, and where the beautiful, haunting call to prayer frequently drifts outward from the Dar al-Hijra Mosque, echoing through the air as the massive, concrete apartment towers rise majestically against the freezing Minnesota sky, standing as towering monuments to a resilient community that has successfully built a complex life, incredibly far from their original home. A young, exhausted mother finally switched off her television set. Her young son, currently 6 years old, proudly American by birthright, and deeply Somali by cultural heritage, had been silently observing the broadcast over her shoulder. Given his young age, he had absolutely not comprehended the complex intricacies of the congressional hearing. He was merely 6, and the proceedings heavily involved highly complex legal words and advanced political concepts that remained entirely beyond his current intellectual grasp. However, he had clearly recognized 2 specific faces displayed prominently on the glowing screen, and he had instantly identified one of them simply because her highly recognizable face was frequently featured on colorful political posters prominently displayed throughout the busy hallways of his apartment complex and plastered across the wide window of the busy coffee shop, located on the street corner. Seeking clarity, he softly asked his mother if the prominent woman on the screen had done something wrong. The mother did not offer an immediate response. Instead, she directed her gaze upward, focusing intently on the wall positioned directly above the television set, where 2 highly specific items hung prominently in protective frames. The first item was a vibrant family photograph, proudly taken within the massive lobby of the Minneapolis Convention Center on the exact, incredibly joyful day she had officially become a naturalized American citizen, capturing her with her right hand raised proudly in the air, her eyes incredibly bright with hope, and the massive American flag serving as a powerful backdrop. The second framed item was the actual official naturalization certificate itself, the incredibly powerful legal document that formally declared her to be a recognized American, fully signed, officially sealed, and undeniably real. Slowly turning her attention back to her young son, she offered a profound lesson. She gently explained to him that possessing an American identity is absolutely not something an individual simply takes for granted. Rather, she emphasized, it is a profound responsibility that an individual must actively earn every single day of their life. The young boy offered a slow, solemn nod, the highly specific, deeply serious type of nod that 6-year-olds frequently employ when they completely lack full comprehension of a complex subject, yet possess a deep, instinctual understanding that the words just spoken to them matter immensely. Satisfied, she reached over and turned off the interior light. Outside the apartment window, the freezing Minneapolis night rapidly settled over the Cedar Riverside neighborhood. It was incredibly cold and entirely clear, the highly specific type of brutal January night, when the distant stars remain perfectly visible, despite the massive ambient light pollution generated by the sprawling city, and where the warm breath of any individual brave enough to step outside instantly forms a small, visible cloud of vapor that briefly rises into the freezing air before rapidly and completely vanishing, perfectly mirroring the inevitable way that all things eventually rise and vanish into the night.